Welcome to the Cold War. Hopefully you checked the Moodle site and can look ahead to see what modules you'll have to be doing in the next couple days, but this war is like no other war. It's not about land, like here's the Nazis invading Poland. It's not about defending yourself, like here's us in Pearl Harbor. It's not about whatever this guy's doing. But the Cold War is all about ideology. Here's a quick definition of ideology for you. So the two sides in this war are the United States, of course, and the Soviet Union. We're a capitalist democracy. What's interesting about the Cold War is that it lasts so long, 1945 to 1989, and it spans 6 Soviet leaders and 9 American presidents. Here's some of the Soviet leaders. There's Lenin at the beginning, and of course you know Stalin. And we'll talk about Khrushchev here, who had an incident with his shoe in the United Nations. This is Leonid Brezhnev. He really liked the United States and came and visited us a few times out in Hollywood and New York. Following him were these two gentlemen, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. They didn't last long, and we'll talk about them when we get into the 1980s. And then the last Soviet leader is a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. And here he is, and certainly he's going to be an important part of the end of the Cold War. As far as the American presidents go, it's, I think, very interesting to note that these gentlemen are all Democrats or Republicans, but yet they had basically the same foreign policy during the Cold War, aimed against the Soviet Union. So here you are. I think you know these guys. This is Harry Truman. He's a Democrat. Following him was Dwight Eisenhower. He was a Republican. Following Eisenhower is John Kennedy. He was a Democrat. After Kennedy's assassination is his Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat. Following Johnson is Richard Nixon, a Republican. After his resignation, his Vice President took over, Gerald Ford. He was a Republican. Following Ford is Jimmy Carter. He was a Democrat. Following Carter was Ronald Reagan, a Republican. And really the last Cold War president was George H.W. Bush, also a Republican. The Cold War also covers many major world events over the last 45 years. Beginning with the Berlin Crisis of 1946, we'll talk a little bit about. There's the Marshall Plan, the Red Scare here in the United States in the 1950s, China going communist. There's the Korean War, a bunch of stuff in Cuba, like the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s. The Vietnam War is all part of the Cold War, as well as global thermonuclear war, all part of the Cold War, which we're about to study together. So I think the big question that we have to ask ourselves really is, what is the Cold War all about, and was it worth it? Obviously, one of the questions that we will be answering at the end of the semester, at the end of the unit, is going to be about was the Cold War worth fighting? And so the big question is fighting for an ideology or a group of ideas better or worse or more valuable or more meaningful than fighting for land or defending yourself? And so to maybe help us answer that, let's look into the different ideologies and see if one is more worthy of fighting for than the other. So what is the difference between the ideologies? Well, let's start with communism. Communism really revolves around one simple concept, and that's produce what you can and take what you need. So let's say you have a wife and 4 kids at home, and you work in a shoe factory, but you're just not very good at making shoes. So you come in, you make whatever shoes you can, and you leave with 2 loaves of bread and 4 cans of soup, because that's what your family needs. On the other hand, let's say you are single and you can make shoes like no one else can make them. You come into the same shoe factory, you make 14 pairs of shoes in a day, and you leave with 2 slices of bread ladle full of soup. So that's the idea of communism, that everyone works to their highest potential and everyone is taken care of. In the United States, we believed in democracy and freedom, which means that there really isn't anyone making sure that anyone is taken care of. In fact, it's really up to ourselves. And so if you work in a shoe factory, first of all, you're lucky you get that job, and no one really cares if you got the job. And if you don't have a job, well, good luck to you. And then you go to buy some soup, and depending on how popular that soup is, the price may be too expensive or not expensive enough for you. So in democracy, there really isn't anyone, any authority controlling and helping things. So let's get to how the Cold War got started. Got to tell you that the United States was kind of late to the game. If you remember, at the end of World War II, we talked about something called the race to Berlin, and how the Soviet Union was racing across Poland and racing across Germany to get as far west as they possibly could. Because Stalin knew that after the war, they would stay exactly where they were. So wherever their armies were, they were planning on staying. And we're going to see that happen again and again in the late 1940s, where we thought the Soviets were going to leave, and they just don't. One of the people who kind of saw what was going on was Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England. And so one of the ways that he helped protect places like the Mediterranean Sea and Greece and Turkey and Italy and those places was to negotiate with Joseph Stalin something called the Naughty Document. So here is the Naughty Document. And if you can read it, what it basically did was divided up Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey between the Allies, the United States and England, and the Soviet Union. And so Churchill, through the Naughty Document, really protected Greece and Turkey and kind of kept the Soviet Union out of the Mediterranean Sea. And this, if you remember back from the first day of class, I think we talked about the Crimean War, and this is something that the Soviet Union always wanted, was a warm water port, maybe through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. But still, even after World War II, thanks to Winston Churchill, he kept the Soviets out of the Mediterranean Sea. Really, it wasn't until Harry Truman took over in 1946 when he realized what Joseph Stalin was doing. And this quote, "I do not think we should compromise any longer. I am tired of babying the Soviets," I think is a clear indication that suddenly Harry Truman began to realize what the problem with the Soviet Union was. And what was that problem? Well, we'll get to it now. If you had a chance to look at the timeline that is in the link there in Moodle, you'll see that on February 9th, 1946, Joseph Stalin declared that communism and capitalism were incompatible and that maybe it was time to start this war up. It wasn't until George Kennan, and this is a picture of George Kennan, and I'm going to say his name again, his name is George Kennan. I don't think he gets enough credit in American history, in world history, and I think he is someone that we should pay attention to. He wrote in 1946 something that became known as the Long Telegram. And basically this was a document that he wrote while in Moscow and sent it back to President Truman, kind of outlining what he thought the Soviet Union was all about. And here is basically what he wrote. So these are the actual words that Kennan wrote in 1946. He wrote that the Soviet Union's goal was to undermine general political and strategic potential of major Western powers. He wrote that on an unofficial plane, particularly violent efforts will be made to weaken power and influence of Western powers on colonial backward or dependent peoples. He wrote, where individual governments stand in the path of Soviet purposes, pressure will be brought for their removal from office. He wrote, in foreign countries, communists will, as a rule, work toward destruction of all forms of personal independence, economic, political, or moral. He wrote, their system can handle only individuals who have been brought into complete dependence on a higher power. Kennan wrote, everything possible will be done to set major Western powers against each other. And finally, he wrote, in general, all Soviet efforts on unofficial international plane will be negative and destructive in character, designed to tear down sources of strength beyond reach of Soviet control. This is only in line with basic Soviet instinct that there can be no compromise with rival power, and that constructive work can start only when communist power is dominant. That's George Kennan in the Long Telegram, 1946, really the first document of the United States that sets out what we really think the Soviet Union is all about, and thus begins the conflict over ideology known as the Cold War. Also, if you look at your timeline, you'll see that really the first place in the world where we realize the implications of this is in the Middle East. And in Iran in 1946, the Soviet Union had troops. The Red Army was there after World War II. They said they were going to leave. We asked them to leave over and over again. And we realized in 1946 that they weren't going to leave. Another hotspot right after World War II was in Greece. And really this was the first time where we started spending money to help protect places like Greece and Turkey and Italy after World War II from communist takeover. It's also in 1946 when Winston Churchill, after he had left the office of Prime Minister of England, he was invited to speak at a college in Fulton, Missouri by President Truman. And it was Churchill who said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line, in all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe, Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia, all these famous cities, and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and, in many cases, increasing measures of control from Moscow." And so Churchill lays it out, that there is an iron curtain that has fallen across Europe. On the east side is the Soviet control, the Soviet sphere of influence, we call it. It's a sphere of influence. On the west side of the Iron Curtain, in places like Italy and Austria and West Germany and Spain and France and England, that's the American sphere of influence, the sphere of influence. And so suddenly we have almost like a conflict line, a war line, a battle line falling across Europe. Now, there wasn't any gunfire, there wasn't any tanks or anything yet, but certainly the Iron Curtain had fallen and the Cold War had begun along that line. So after we realized that we were in a new kind of conflict called the Cold War, thanks to George Kennan, who in his Long Telegram talked about the real intentions of the Soviet Union, and thanks to Winston Churchill for outlining the Iron Curtain in his speech in 1946, we realized that something had to be done. And so we brought up our first policy for the United States during the Cold War, and it was brought up and created by George Kennan again, that man who we kind of lose sight of and don't give enough credit for. But George Kennan came up with what became known as the policy of containment. So the policy of the United States was really, we weren't going to defeat the Soviet Union, we weren't going to attack them, we just wanted to contain where they were. And so they had all of Eastern Europe, they had obviously the Soviet Union, and that was good enough, and that's all we were going to let them have. And this became known once again as the policy of containment. This was the first American policy towards the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So that really is how the Cold War begins. There's no major battle, there's no major conflict, there's no major argument, except for both sides begin to realize what each other is all about. And so it took some smart people on our side to kind of figure out what the Soviet Union was about, and we made policies and strategies to counter what they were doing. And so we end really, at this point in time, we end with the world divided in two, between the two spheres of influence, the United States on one side with democracy and capitalism, the Soviet Union on the other side with communism. And in our next episode, in our next module, actually in 2 modules, module 3 this week, we'll learn a little bit more about the principles of American foreign policy and how we implemented them in the world following World War II. At this point, you want to look at the timeline down there in this module. Take the little quiz, and if you score the appropriate score, you can move on to Module 2. Thanks.